When I started with the Fantastic Four, and then Spider-Man and the Hulk and Daredevil and the X-Men and Iron Man and so forth, we were becoming superhero specialists.
Well, comics have captured the imagination probably since people started drawing on caves 30,000 years ago.
I think comics work because it's a really good way to tell stories. And comics can tell any kind of story there is.
Everyone always says that the only true American art form is jazz, but that's really not true. We created jazz and we created, the comic book.
Comics is where all pop culture starts today.
It's telling stories, it's adventure, it's fun, it's rock and roll. It's the best art form that ever existed, the best art form that ever existed.
I like the fans a lot. They're all really cool. They're all really good people. Yeah.
It's an ability to be able to get out of the mundane life and escape to where you can fly. It's where you can sparkle.
May the mystic orb of Agamotto shine on you.
I don't dress like this to be ignored, damn it.
80% of the time, people who really probably shouldn't be dressed as Superman.
Mommy, that man's wearing his underwear.
You know, statistically speaking, flying's still the safest way to travel.
This is their way of connecting, and this is their way of expressing that this is a character that's meant something to them.
I've always wanted to be Batman, and this is the only place where you can legally and sanely be looked at as Batman.
It's very important to match the writer with a really great artist, or a great colorist, also a great editor. All those things have to work together just right to get a great book.
The purpose of a comic book is to tell a story.
At their core, comic books are about character. Either you like that character or you don't, and not just because he can climb a wall. You like Spider-Man because he's Peter Parker, who can climb a wall.
It's a more popular time for superheroes than it's been in 20 years.
The main draw for people to read comics and go to conventions is it really allows you to go into a different world, into a world outside of this.
It's a really good time for comics. That's superheroes, that's human drama. I mean, something for everybody. From the 6-year-old kid to the 80-year-old man that's been in comics his whole life.
People are attracted to adventure, to stories, to imagination.
Right now in comics, I think we have the best material being published with the most broad diversity of all time.
There's a real instantaneousness of the communication in comics that doesn't exist in a lot of other areas.
I'm the luckiest guy in the world, to be able to do this. It's a great life. I get up every day, I think about Superman and Batman, I go to bed.
Everyone who reads comic books is now sitting at the Cool Kids table. Everyone who creates comics is now sitting at the Cool Kids table. And it's about time, because there's a lot of really great ideas coming out of kids who are now sitting at the Cool Kids table.
We all know as a comic book. And the reason they're called comic book is the original comic books were reprints of the comics that were in newspapers. So they took this pamphlet was basically, the reason it was this size, and it wasn't this size, they were actually larger and they were cost a dime. But the reason it was like this is that they could get so many cuts on a sheet of paper at that size. And then they could fold it, and then it was newsprint on the inside, the same thing that the newspaper was printed on. And then they took like the magazine slick paper or the ad slick, and put it to wrap it so that it would stand up in the newsstand.
Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who had done a comic book about a Superman. Now, when they first did it, he was a villain. And then they did it again, he was a hero. And they tried to sell it, as all kids do, to the syndicated strips.
Action Comics #1 comes out, Superman hits, and you have never seen to this day, and probably never will see, an explosion in pop culture like that.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the Man of Steel, Superman.
The way Superman hit, not only was he in 1 million comic books a month, but he's in the newspapers before long, he's on movie screens, he's on the radio, this is all within a year or two. And if you can imagine something like The Simpsons, or something that has been a huge cultural influence in our lifetime, the impact with which that stuff hit doesn't compare to the penetration, the impact that happened in the 1930s.
So they said to all their creators that they could talk to, create a superhero. Forget the detectives and the cowboys. We don't want to do those anymore. Make superheroes.
And that kicked off what we call, again, the golden age of comics. Comics were huge during the 1940s, in part because a lot of overseas servicemen were reading them because they're easy to read. You can stick them in your back pocket, you can carry them around. Will Eisner, who created The Spirit, was the first guy to really bring a cinematic sense to comics, like a real sort of he took a lot of what he saw in films of the 40s and was informed by that, and it didn't so much look like simple comic strips. He would bring that sort of the weird camera angles and the interesting cinematography and bring that back to comics, and he was a huge influence. By the early 1950s, TV's beginning to come into its own. Circulations in magazines in general is just dropping, and there are also some scares from social activists saying that comics are maybe bad for kids and maybe they're promoting negative values.
There was a psychiatrist. He attributed every ill that was known to mankind to comic books. Claimed that they were ruining the younger generation, and there were articles in the newspapers and magazines.
And right next to communists being tried in Congress, comic books were being tried in Congress. Comic books were nearly destroyed.
So to protect themselves, the comic book publishers formed an association. I think it was called the Comic Magazine Association of America, and they were a self-censorship body. All the publishers had to submit all the pages to them before they would go to the printer.
It wasn't until after 1953 that habit in America began, telling your kid not to read a comic book.
Parents, as they often do, got scared of their own kids. The juvenile delinquency thing, such a threat. And of course looked for reasons besides the fact that they were probably rotten parents for why the kids were misbehaving. They attached themselves to comic books just as they now do to video games.
And so all of these things contributed to a real shrinking of the marketplace in the early 1950s. And there were still comics published, but superheroes all but went away as a genre. A lot of horror comics went away as a genre. And then in the mid-50s, DC Comics relaunched some of its superheroes just kind of on a flyer. So Flash comes out in 1956, huge success. Let's try it again. We do with Green Lantern, another huge success. And so this begins what we now retroactively call the Silver Age of comics.
All of comic books sits between these two characters. Superman, the greatest, most powerful superhero of all. Batman, the least powerful superhero. He's not bitten by a radioactive spider. Nobody came down and hit him with a lightning bolt and made him super fast. Nothing happened to him except his parents were killed. And he became the other end of superheroes in comics. These two characters delineated what comic books and what superheroes were to become. Superhero comic books.